If you haven't got enough energy to get a job done, you can't wish it there. If the maths tells you there isn't enough energy to lift up a brick, you can't lift up the brick. You can't pass a law to lift the brick up. It just won't work.
Now suddenly when South Africa and Africa tries to engage on a development path, the rules have changed. And the rules change because of scientific discovery. And if we cannot listen to science, then we indeed are lost.
At this point, there's 2 workers actually at the plant who passed away, but their deaths are related to the earthquake itself and not to the accident.
Here you have an old nuclear power station. Nature throws at it the worst it possibly can, the worst possible earthquake, one of the worst tsunamis ever, followed by dozens of other serious earthquakes, and we still have only 1 nuclear-related death apparently, and that is the farmer who committed suicide because he couldn't sell his cattle. And so I think to myself, why am I seeing this so differently from everyone else? I think, could you have a better controlled experiment? Could you subject nuclear to a more substantial safety test than this? And it has survived, at least so far, fully. And so I just don't get it. I really don't. And I've asked anti-nuclear people to explain to me, or anyone, nuclear people. Everyone seems to think that this is evidence of why we have to go back to the drawing boards and reconsider. And I keep saying to people, but can they tell me why? It seems to me quite the opposite. It seems to me you could not ask. I mean, what other evidence could you ask for than this? This has got to be the consummate evidence of the safety of nuclear. And I'm not a nuclear physicist and I'm not a scientist, so if I'm missing it, please tell me why. Tell me what's wrong about the way it seems to me to be conspicuously obvious. So that aside, I'm going to be talking about aspects of economics, and let me immediately say that on the question of energy economics, having dealt with my view of nuclear, that's about the end of what I have to say about nuclear specifically, is that one of the things we have is emotion versus scientists, and I thought afterwards I should have said science, because unfortunately far too many scientists have signed up with the emotional side of the discourse rather than the science side. And let me just look at that, because there are a couple of issues. One of them is energy, where I just again don't get it. I don't get why the passion and the emotion comes, and it seems predominantly from the anti-nuclear side. This is where one tends to see the passion, and it's similar to me to another discourse with which I'm involved, which is open source software. Now here you also have, you would have thought that, you know, whether you use open source or proprietary or what kind of software you use is just a practical decision, a cost-benefit analysis, efficiency question. But you find the same thing as in nuclear. You find the advocates, it's a kind of religion actually, of people for open source, and there are probably some in this room. It's a kind of passionate belief that this is somehow virtuous, and non-open source is not virtuous. And there's another great similarity there, for what it's worth, with nuclear, and that is that the people who engage in the discourse on the side that's characterized by emotion seem not to really bother with very elementary facts, such as open source is fully subject to proprietary, copyright and licensing law, as you'll find if you go to any open source software website. Now, I'm not here to talk about open source, but I just want to say there are these debates and discourses where I struggle to work out what is turning people on, what is getting these passions, these sort of religions, it's like religious fundamentalism going. And I just can't get it. I just don't get anyone explaining to me why these passions arise. So I don't approach this issue with any passion. I approach this issue as weighing up the economics of it, and that's what I intend to address now. So there are many energy economics sources or resources, and let me immediately say that if you go to, you know, the favorite thing nowadays is you don't go to a library, you go to Google. And if you Google energy economics or economics of energy, you get entire websites, entire institutes, organizations, massive, massive resources devoted to it. But it's largely actually highly technical and highly specialized, and is in fact in the field not of really economics, but of business economics. It's all about the financing and costing and charging of energy and things like transmission of energy and so on. Not really about the macroeconomics or the econometrics or the institutional or behavioral economics, which are other branches of economics, familiar I'm sure with some people here, and what I'm going to call for the time being just some economics 101. And one of the things Kelvin always does to me, explains to me what an atom is, and I go away being more confused than I was before. I explain to him economics 101, and he goes away more confused than he was before. So with physicists, I tend to find we have to get back to some of these very, very elementary basics. Now, the first thing is this, and for the physicists over here, I have very good news. The whole of economic science is reduced for you by me into one word, Tanztafel. And if you remember this, you are entitled to a PhD in economics. This is all you need to know. There's nothing else you need to know. All of economics is a derivative of that word, Tanztafel, which is the acronym for the ain't no such thing as a free lunch. The one you're about to have later is not free. No lunches are ever free. Everything has a cost. And the biggest single flaw in economic analysis is a failure to calculate cost, especially secondary costs, dynamic costs, that's costs over time. Most calculations are static, immediate cost, and cost in a coherent, proper sense. So all of economics is a derivative of that one single concept. If you look up the definition in a dictionary, it will say, for example, the study of scarcity, which is really saying the same thing. If you have more of A, you do so by having less of B. So, for example, I try to persuade people that if they say we should spend more on education and training, I say to them, please just spend one day of your life whenever you recommend something. Instead of saying what it is you recommend, say what it is you want to forego to have that. So in other words, if you say we should spend more on education, what you are saying, we should have more children dying in pediatric units, or we should have more road fatalities, or we should have more rape. Everything you are in favor of, you get by having less of other things you're in favor of. Now that is very, very difficult to deal with. I, myself, having said this, I do what we all do. I sit at a dinner table and I say, I wonder why they don't fix the potholes. Well, what I should say is, I wonder why they don't increase the rape rate. Because that's what saying fix the potholes amounts to. You're saying have more of something else you don't want. And that question of the trade-offs is actually one of the very most difficult things, almost impossible things to remember in the field of economics. The other one that's very difficult is the price mechanism, the role of prices. Now, I was in a meeting, for example, with one of my tutors on the issues of energy, Brian Statham, sitting at the back there, and some other very knowledgeable people in the field of energy in the early days of 2007 energy crisis. And somebody said to me, or engineer said, the problem can't be solved, it's going to take years, there's no short-term solution. And I said, no, there is a short-term solution. In fact, I can solve the problem by midnight tonight. And I can do it by one simple method, and that's raise the price. If you raise the price enough, consumption will fall to meet demand, and demand and supply will be in balance at the right price. Now, anyone from Eskom over here, like Brian, should immediately give me a royalty because I am the leading campaigner for raising the price to the price at which consumption falls. You should not have running ads saying, please don't buy my product. And this is bizarre. This is like Pick n Pay saying, you know, please fine consumers for shopping. This is what Eskom is currently doing because it's not allowed to raise the price. If it did raise the price, then the people who really need energy, that is where energy has a high value, would continue consuming or even increase consumption, build more factories, build more shopping centers, sink more mines, whatever. And in areas where you can save, like me personally, I could switch off my geyser, which I now won't do because the price isn't high enough. So the people who can save would, and you would reduce consumption to demand by midnight tonight. It's that simple. Then, of course, once the price is that high, you will, of course, attract all sorts of people into the energy field, and in maximum speed, the price will come down again to a what's called an evenly rotating economy level. So the price mechanism is really the solution. Personally, for what it's worth, for the people from Eskom, as Brian knows, I don't blame Eskom, I blame the policy, the regulation, and particularly NERSA. So if you're from NERSA, then please take it from me that you've nursed us into this problem. And it's a regulatory problem. If you have correct economic policies, you would have no energy shortage ever. Certainly not even in the short term, and within a medium to long term, the problem would be solved completely if you respect the laws of economics. And the laws of economics, by the way, are just like the laws of gravity, for example. If you want to take off near us here at the airport, it doesn't matter whether you're historically disadvantaged, whether you were colonized, whether you're rich, whether you're resource rich, whether you're poor, small, big, white, black, Chinese, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, doesn't really matter. The laws of gravity apply equally to all. If you can't say we're going to have less thrust because we were historically disadvantaged, you just won't take off. And so it is with economics. The laws are pretty ruthless, and for what it's worth, one of the things the laws of economics do is if you adopt bad policies, they punish you very severely, extremely, and rapidly. You go into economic contraction. And if you have good policies, which essentially amounts to free market policies, and I'll explain in a moment why that's the case, then the laws of economics reward you very rapidly, generously, and quickly. You go into very high rates of economic growth. There are basically no exceptions. The exceptions really are so rare that they reinforce the general rule that freer economies grow faster, outperform less free economies in every measured index. There are about 200 indices of human and non-human conditions, and freer economies outperform less free economies, including in energy, in every measured, objectively measured way. And that's really not subject anymore to informed debate. That really cannot seriously be debated, and if anyone wants the sources, they're very simple. Off our website, for example, is free software anyone can download with all the relevant data, World Bank, World Economic Forum, United Nations, IMF, and so on. And the software enables you to do all the number crunching yourself. You don't have to be sophisticated, and you can see for yourself exactly what policies correlate with which outcomes. It's not just growth and prosperity that you get, but it's more equality with freer economies, less crime, less unemployment, less alcoholism, even less things like road accidents. So that's no longer subject to debate, and we'll see how that applies to economics in a moment. The other sort of economics 101 is the seen and the unseen, and I'm going to get a bit back to that, is because a lot of what gets discussed is what you see. For example, the early estimates of the cost of the energy crisis in South Africa was what you can see, the loss of revenue to Eskom. That is what people said the cost was of the crisis. Well, of course, that's not the case at all. The real cost is the unseen. It's the things that you couldn't see. It's the shopping centres that didn't get built, the mines that didn't get developed, the ITC that didn't get done, the people who didn't have, I don't know, hot supper, whatever it was, the farmers, for example, who couldn't milk their cattle because they couldn't run their electronic milking machines and didn't have enough people to manually milk the cows and so on. So these are the unseen and the secondary costs, and I'm going to tell you in a moment what they really amounted to when you look at it in a proper economics way. But before I go off Economics 101, I just want to re-emphasize that markets actually work. And if I say our integrated energy plan, one of the things that really bothers me about it is that it actually is a plan. It's people thinking they can decide in advance what the future economy will be. That's fundamentally misunderstanding economics. You must respond to markets and not try to plan markets in advance. Now, just to tell you what this does for me personally is, since I understand economics, I know that if you want to increase supply, what you have to do is increase demand. And so what I do is you consume as much electricity as I can. I encourage everyone else to do so. We want maximum demand, and then we are likely to see more rapid increases of supply and more rapid adjustment of prices to market clearing rates. And whenever I see an advertisement saying buy less of what I sell, I just imagine Raymond Ackerman doing that with Pick and Pay. I find it amusing and tragic. It is nonsense to say buy less of my product and actually ask the government to fine people for using your product. This is just simply unacceptable. But of course we know why Eskom does it, because they're not allowed to charge the market clearing price, which is what they ought to be doing. So anyway, I encourage you all to increase your energy consumption as much as you can, thereby helping solve the problem quicker. If you cut your energy consumption, you will actually delay solutions, discourage investment by Eskom, by independent power producers. You will discourage people saving, you will discourage efficient use of energy, so saving electricity is actually not a contribution to the problem, not at least to an economist. Now let me just briefly, with energy and prosperity, make this observation, and I'm going to quote mainly David Stern, one of the leading authorities. There are many others, but essentially what the data shows is that energy and GDP have what's called a strong link. They co-integrate, that is, one feeds on the other, they feed into each other, and GDP tends to grow faster than energy. In other words, you are not going to have prosperity or growth without having energy, and when you have energy available, you have growth rates that tend internationally, statistically, econometrically to rise faster than energy supplies. So from an economics point of view, energy is absolutely critical. Energy scarcity curtails growth, and that's quite serious. We'll look at some numbers in a moment. Energy efficiency is important, especially for electricity. In the USA, for example, from 73 to 91, there was growth without significant increases in consumption of energy. In other words, massive increases in energy efficiency. And you may say I'm contradicting myself. No, I'm not. What you want to do to get energy efficiency is raise the price of energy. I get back to the price mechanism. If you ignore the law of prices, you are just simply not going to solve the problem. You will have eternal shortages and surpluses. You will simply vacillate from one to the other. Only the price mechanism can maintain a modicum of stability, because it adjusts quickly to the realities of supply and demand. Energy efficiency declines from electricity to gas to oil to coal to wood to biofuels. And I can go into that, or look up Stern if you want on the internet and get all the relevant data. That's one of the major sources. But as I say, there's an enormous amount on this. Now, the real cost of the energy crisis to South Africa, statistician Johan Zitzman, by the way, Garth Zitzman, I mean, who, for what it's worth, is a South African who has the second highest recorded IQ in the world. Interesting that we have him in South Africa. I'm sorry for all the men in the audience. The person with the highest recorded IQ in the world is a woman, and I'm sorry for all the brunettes in the world. She happens to be blonde, Marilyn Savant. But we at least have the second highest, so he's the highest IQ man. He and an economist, John Hewson, did some calculations for us. They adopted 7 approaches, of which these are the ones that are completed, not the work in progress. A questionnaire to people consuming energy, what they considered the cost. A more interesting one was, what would you be willing to pay to have electricity instead of not to have it? That's probably, from an economics point of view, the most accurate question to ask. The GDP trend line to see what the impact of the crisis was on the economy, the econometric calculation, which they did as economists normally would. They asked experts, leading people in the field, to make educated guesses, and then finally they looked at the cost of generators that were purchased and fuel used for generators to try and work out the impact on the economy. They concluded that it cost the country 5% of GDP, 5% less GDP. A minimum of 229 billion rand was lost in a single year to the economy. Now, please bearing in mind that is compounded forever. So 5% of the GDP, or 130 roughly billion rand, average. The different methods came to different results, but that's pretty much the average. Averaged over time, that compounds. And just for those of you that aren't familiar with this, it's the rule of 7 or the rule of 72. If, for example, you grow at 7%, your wealth doubles every 10 years. If you grow at 10%, your wealth doubles every 7, which is why a slightly higher growth rate is very, very important. But if you do some calculations on that, you can see what the implications are if you grow at a slightly slower growth rate forever into the future, or you grow off a lower GDP base. the relative poverty caused, for example, 20 years from now, a generation from now, 40 years from now, becomes actually quite breathtaking and quite frightening. Just to give you some idea of what this means in practice, 100 billion or 130 billion rand, actually, it shouldn't be 100 billion over there, is the equivalent of one power station roughly, or 120% of the housing backlog. In 1 year, we lost enough to overcome the entire housing backlog in South Africa, 1.5 times the roads backlog. 30 mines could have been built, food for all South Africans for 1.5 months, and clothing for all South Africans for a year, or 600,000 motor vehicles. That's what was lost in a single year, the equivalent of the, and that is how important energy is. So it's not just important to generate growth. Without it, you won't prosper, but it's also negative. If you don't have energy, then you cause this amount of damage. Energy scarcity implications are obviously less industry, telecoms don't work, ITC, property development, many property developments couldn't proceed because they couldn't get energy. In fact, even little one, my sister-in-law and retired brother-in-law buying a house in Wokkerstroom, they couldn't get their building plans passed because they couldn't get electricity, so they literally couldn't build their retirement home in a little dorp in the middle of nowhere looking at birds. Mines don't get built. Our mining production, as probably you all know, has dropped off frighteningly. Transport doesn't take place, tourism and so on. Agriculture is one of the big ones impacted that is seldom discussed. People can't keep their products cool, they can't undertake all sorts of things that you need electricity for, pumping and so on farms. Now I'm going to get towards the end, and I just want to speak a little bit about environmental questions, which is always, as arises in every talk up to now, on the nuclear front, and give some ideas I have now. One of the things that really bothers me is that all our environmentalism comes from essentially the first world, and it seems to me there's a desperate need, an urgent need for what I would call an African or development or third world perspective on environmentalism, and we just swallow what's dished up from the world's richest countries, which have already gone through the growth path we need to go through by doing things like filling in wetlands, which were easier to fill in when they were called swamps, and harvesting rainforests, which were easier to harvest when they were called jungles. So if you call them wetlands and rainforests, it's kind of sexy, but if you call them jungles and swamps, which you should do in the developing world, then you can understand more why you should utilize them. Now, I'm old enough to remember when global cooling was the scare in the 60s. I remember being a radical. I was a communist student, anti-apartheid activist. In fact, in this very building, which Tiens Elof referred to, is where I kind of earned my Nobel Peace Prize nomination, working on South Africa's transition. And in those days, as a sort of radical lefty, we were into global cooling, and everyone was talking about how on earth can we stop the planet going into the next big ice age. Then it became conservationism, then environmentalism, then global warming. Now it's called climate change, and I'm not sure what the next name will be. But nonetheless, it goes through these mutations, and what worries me is that it's all dished up to us by people in the first developed world for whom the economics is a completely different question. Conservation and environmentalism, in my view, have to be cost-benefit efficient, and we've heard comments to that effect from Lloyd, Professor Lloyd, for example. And what we have to do is be very clear about this, is that cost-benefit analysis, regulatory impact assessment, into which South Africa is meant to be going. Our first three were on the four labour bills now under consideration, is that what that requires is everything must be and can be quantified. Nothing can or should be left to feelings and emotions. For example, in Britain, where they do regulatory impact assessments on every new policy, not just law, every policy, they wanted to implement measures to protect people from dangerous dogs, pit bull terriers that killed some children, and they had some dog control laws, and they failed the cost-benefit analysis by simply saying how many less attacks will there be, what will each attack cost, how much, what else could we have used this money for, how many lives could have been saved if we spent it on something else instead, and so on and so forth. And then in the end they do not implement a dangerous dog law, so that there's nothing beyond this, whether it's child abuse, rape, whatever, everything can and should be quantified. and so it should be with environmental concerns, nothing left to emotion. Now, one of the things that just defies every concept of economics is the so-called precautionary principle, and although I said I'm not a scientist, as an economist I can tell you that it's nonsense. The precautionary principle would mean you shouldn't be sitting here now because you should be taking precautions against this building collapsing, and the fact that you are sitting now means you're violating the precautionary principle, which means you shouldn't take risks. Well, of course you must take risks. Risks are things you trade off in cost, and you take them according to whether it's efficient or inefficient to take those risks. Now, wind, I'm not necessarily for nuclear or coal or anything else. I'm for what's efficient and makes sense economically. But I'd have a certain concern about wind energy and some other aspects of renewables, and I just want to address that a little. I'm going to in a moment. But on nuclear, let me say that I'm somewhat worried about what happened to PBMR, for example. I did meet with Jaco Crick once, and I suggested to him that it seemed to me to be a perfectly viable business proposition. I volunteered to do a business economics analysis of PBMR, and my view was it could have been floated on the New York or London Stock Exchange, and it could have become immediately a commercial proposition. I was told that in fact their calculation was there was no point in this because it was much easier to get money from the government. I said, no, you won't, and I was right and they were wrong. And it's a great sadness, and I think that it should have been not closed down, but should have literally been floated as a commercial public venture. And I did quite a lot of work on it, by the way, and there are good reasons why I thought that could be done. The world's experience with liberalization of energy is massive cost savings. I'm not going to talk about that, but as a free market person, I just want to point out that we really do need to, for example, move into having an independent system and market operator, and look in the long term to bringing in competitive, dynamic, unplanned, unregulated energy markets with independent power producers. And in my view, Eskom needs to be freed from political and other constraints to be able to be a proper dynamic energy provider in South Africa. Wind energy just has many hidden costs. You have to have backup and base load. In other words, build but don't actually use the stuff. And there are some of these figures I'm not going to go through because my time is up, but you just glance at them and I think they make sense on their own. But what I will do is just show you some pictures. This isn't wind energy, this is Shimweni, little game lodge in the Kruger Park, the one my wife and I like the most. We big greenies, by the way, outdoor people. And we go there, and this is famed as the green, small little rest camp. I think there are only about 6 cottages in it, or maybe 8 or so. And the areas circled over there it's meant to be the ultimate green camp in the Kruger Park. And by the way, the Kruger Park is now no longer claims that on its website. It used to be, and that's, by the way, why we first went there. We still like it, but it was because it was this green place. And I'm a softy, greeny, bunny-hugging person, which is, by the way, why I like nuclear. But well, I think I like nuclear. It seems to make sense economically because I like bunnies. But this is, over there they have solar energy. They fame themselves on solar energy. And of course, when the clouds and it's raining and so on, you can't have solar energy. So they also have to have generators. And to have generators, you have to have big diesel reserves. And sometimes the generating and plant breaks down, and so you also then have to get into the base load. So they have power lines coming from Pelaborwa. So they're plugged into the grid, they have solar and they have diesel all in one, and this is meant to be like green. I heard every night, I heard this engine starting up, and I wandered through the veld to the back there, and I found not only that, but the batteries in those buildings on the right, there's no one there. There's a few game rangers who are really interested in scorpions and things, not this stuff. And so the batteries die, and the batteries are lying outside, and the acid is leaching through the fence into the Kruger Park. The diesel engine, diesel is leaching. It has to be the most environmentally unfriendly camp in the world, with battery acid and lead and diesel fuel and engines running and power lines coming in. It's sort of like all in one. It's like this tiny little place, which seems to me to say, again as an economist, surely this is not energy efficiency. This is, I mean, it's really very sad. And so there we have it. If we look at, for example, Cape Town, one small power station takes up whatever it is, 1 square kilometre, that amount of energy would require a wind farm of 800 square kilometres, which would be about that size. Now the power station is too small to see, it's a little dot in the middle there. That's the amount of wind farm you would need to have to generate as much as that little old power station, which I think now doesn't generate, or I don't know if it does, it's not really germane to my talk. If you try to generate the envisaged capacity for South Africa, that is how big the wind farm of South Africa would have to be, or a 3 kilometre wide band of windmills from Johannesburg to Cape Town. And this just doesn't seem to me a good use of land, it doesn't seem to me a good use of resources, of chemicals, of anything. And talk of renewables, it takes the wind out of the air. I'm not sure if anyone has worked out, what environmental functions wind serves. But as a kind of Buddhist, I would really just not interfere with the wind. I think we should leave it alone, and we should use more environmentally friendly energy. And then, because in deference to our respected visitor from India, I happen to have just written a novel set in India, by the way. The movie rights have been bought by Bollywood, so I'm a kind of honorary Indian. And when I've been traveling around India and Nepal, this is about as much as I know about energy. I think this has got to be a very inefficient way of getting electricity and telephone lines and things around. And I just love their wiring over there. This is just some examples of the wiring you see in Nepal and India. And with that, I'm going to close and say that really the bottom line of energy is it needs to be stripped of its emotion, it needs to be subjected to proper economic cost-benefit analysis, and to that end physicists and economists have to understand each other and collaborate, and we need policies that respect markets, respect the price mechanism, respect the laws of economics, and follow what in fact works. The financial journalist Bokhi Mabukwani says that people are entitled to their own opinions, not their own facts. And so I'm going to give you some facts, and that is freer economies outperform less free economies at everything, including energy, and they are the best way to decide what the energy mix should be. And that decision should not be made now, should not be made by wise people in this room, but should be made by energy operators in a dynamic energy market out there. Thanks for your attention.